The physician's hands are cold against her swollen belly. Petronia is 22 years old, and she has learned to keep her face empty when men touch her, to retreat to a place inside her mind where their hands cannot reach. But this examination is different. This examination has witnesses. This examination will determine something that she does not yet fully understand, but that makes the other household slaves look at her with expressions she cannot read. Pity, perhaps, or relief that it is her and not them. The examination room is a small chamber off the main atrium of the Villa Serviliana, 12 miles outside Rome on the Via Appia. Morning light filters through a single high window, casting a rectangle of gold across the stone floor. The air smells of the olive oil the physician uses to smooth his movements, mixed with the herbs burning in a bronze dish meant to purify the space. Petronia can hear birds singing in the garden beyond the walls, their song obscenely cheerful against the tension that fills this room like smoke. Her master stands against the far wall, arms crossed, watching the examination with the same expression he wears when inspecting livestock at market. Gaius Servilius Vatia is 43 years old, a man of medium height and unremarkable features whose ordinariness conceals a mind that has turned the management of human property into something approaching art. He does not look at Petronia's face. He has not looked at her face in the 7 months since she was brought to his chamber, since the night that created the life now growing inside her. He looks at her belly the way he looks at any investment, calculating returns. 7 months, the physician announces. The child is positioned correctly. Based on the size, I estimate a healthy birth weight. The mother is strong. She should survive delivery without complications. Should survive. The words hang in the air. Petronia has been a slave since birth, the daughter of a slave, the granddaughter of a slave. She has never known freedom, never expected it, never imagined a life different from the one she leads. But she has also never been pregnant before. She has never felt life moving inside her, never experienced the strange doubling of existence that comes from carrying another person within your own body. She has heard stories from older slaves about what happens to pregnant women in Roman households. The stories vary. Some masters value pregnant slaves, protect them, ensure they receive adequate food and rest because the children they carry represent valuable property. Other masters see pregnancy as inconvenience, as lost labor, as a problem to be solved through methods that the storytellers describe only in whispers. She does not know which kind of master Gaius Servilius Vatia is. She has been in this household for only 18 months, purchased at auction after her previous owner's death dissolved his estate. She knows that Vatia is methodical, that he keeps detailed records of every slave's productivity, that he makes decisions based on numbers rather than emotion. She knows that he visits certain female slaves at night, that he has fathered multiple children within this household, that those children occupy positions she does not fully understand in the complex hierarchy of Roman slavery. What she does not know is what will happen to the child she carries. What will happen to her? The question, Vatia says, speaking for the first time since the examination began, is whether the investment justifies the cost. The physician nods, as if this is a reasonable framework for discussing a human life. The mother's labor value during pregnancy and nursing is approximately 18 months of reduced productivity. Against this, you must weigh the value of a verna at current market rates. Homeborn slaves command premiums of 30 to 40% over foreign captured stock. If the child is healthy and survives to working age, I know the calculations, Vatia interrupts. I've made them many times. What I need to know is whether this particular pregnancy will produce a particular kind of child. Something changes in the room. Petronia feels it before she understands it. The physician's hands pause their examination. The slaves, standing attendants at the door, seem to stop breathing. You want me to determine, the physician begins. The sex. I need to know whether she carries a boy or a girl. The physician hesitates. There are methods, traditional examinations, observations of the mother's appearance and behavior, but none are reliable. The gods alone know. The gods are not managing my household accounts, Vatia says. Tell me your best assessment. The physician looks at Petronia's belly, at her face, at the way she carries the weight. He checks her pulse, examines her eyes, asks her questions about her cravings and her dreams. The examination takes another 15 minutes, while Petronia stands motionless, trying not to think about what the answer might mean. Based on the traditional indicators, the physician finally says, I believe she carries a female. Vatia's expression does not change, but something shifts in his posture, a subtle relaxation that Petronia recognizes as satisfaction. He had hoped for this answer. A female child means something to him that a male would not. Good, he says. Continue monitoring her through delivery. I want weekly reports on her condition. Ensure she receives adequate nutrition, but do not coddle her. I need her back at full productivity within 3 months of birth. He turns and walks out of the room without another glance at Petronia. The physician begins packing his instruments. The attending slaves resume their duties. The examination is over. But Petronia remains standing where she was told to stand, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, wondering why her master wants a daughter, wondering what plans he has already made for a child not yet born, wondering whether the life inside her is a blessing or a curse, an opportunity or a sentence. She will learn the answers to these questions over the coming months. She will learn things about Roman slavery that the histories preferred not to record, that the marble monuments and heroic statues chose to ignore, that the civilization still celebrated as the foundation of Western law built its wealth upon, while pretending it did not exist. She will learn what Roman masters did to the female slaves who became pregnant with their children, and she will learn why so many women in her position prayed not for safe delivery, but for miscarriage. What you are about to learn has been systematically sanitized from the history of Rome that most people know. The textbooks discuss slavery in the abstract, mentioning numbers and economic impacts while avoiding the intimate realities that made the system function. The marble statues in museums do not depict the slave quarters where human beings were bred like livestock. The legal codes that scholars praise as foundations of justice do not advertise the provisions that gave masters absolute power over children they fathered with their own property. Tonight, you will learn what that power actually meant. How Roman law created a system where men could father children with enslaved women and own those children as property. How the principle of partus sequitur ventrem, the offspring follows the womb, transformed motherhood into a mechanism of perpetual enslavement. How masters made calculated decisions about which pregnancies to allow and which to terminate, based purely on economic analysis. You will learn about the vernae, the homeborn slaves who were considered more valuable than foreign captives because they had been conditioned from birth to accept their status. You will learn why masters specifically sought to impregnate their most intelligent, most attractive, most capable female slaves, and what they did with the children who resulted. You will learn about the breeding programs that some households operated with the same systematic attention they applied to horse breeding or cattle improvement. You will learn about the quotas that certain estates imposed on their female slaves, the penalties for failing to conceive, the rewards for producing valuable offspring. You will learn what happened to children who were deemed unsuitable, defective, or simply inconvenient. You will learn about the exposure sites outside Roman cities, where unwanted infants were left to die or to be collected by those who had other uses for abandoned children. You will learn why some masters forced pregnant slaves to abort while others forbade abortion under penalty of severe punishment, and how both policies served the same underlying logic of human beings as property. You will learn about the mothers who watch their children sold away from them, sometimes at ages as young as 7, separated forever, because a buyer offered an attractive price. You will learn about the fathers who sat at dinner with their legitimate families while their enslaved children served the meal, recognizing features they saw in their own mirrors, but acknowledging nothing. Subscribe if you want to understand what Rome actually was beneath the glory and the conquest and the architectural achievements. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Because Petronia is still standing in that examination room, still wondering what her master's satisfaction means, still not knowing that the child she carries has already been assigned a purpose that will shape both of their lives. But before I tell you what Gaius Servilius Vatia planned for Petronia's daughter, before I reveal the system that had been refined over centuries to extract land for Petronia's daughter, before I reveal the system that had been refined over centuries to extract maximum value from enslaved women's bodies, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Roman slavery actually functioned, what legal frameworks made it possible, and why a man like Vatia could do what he did without any Roman considering it wrong. Because you cannot understand what happened to Petronia without understanding the world that created men like her master. Roman slavery was not an accident or an aberration. It was the foundation upon which Roman civilization was built, the economic engine that powered everything from agricultural production to urban services to the personal comfort of every freeborn citizen. At the height of the empire, slaves constituted approximately 30 to 40% of the population of Italy. In the city of Rome itself, perhaps 1 in 3 residents was enslaved. These numbers are difficult to comprehend in modern terms. Imagine a society where 1/3 of everyone you see on the street, in shops, in public spaces, is legally property. Imagine that this condition is inherited, that the children of slaves are automatically slaves regardless of who fathered them, that there is no path to freedom except the arbitrary decision of an owner who has no obligation to grant it. This was Rome. This was the reality beneath the Senate debates and the military conquests and the philosophical discussions about virtue and justice. The legal framework that made this possible had been developed over centuries, refined by generations of jurists who approached human property with the same systematic attention they applied to contracts and land ownership. Roman law distinguished between different categories of property: res mancipi, things that required formal transfer procedures, included land, beasts of burden, and slaves. The very language classified human beings alongside oxen and mules, items of agricultural equipment that happened to be capable of speech. Within this framework, the principle of partus sequitur ventrem established that children inherited their mother's status at the moment of birth. If the mother was free, the child was free regardless of the father's status. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved regardless of the father's status. This single principle created the conditions for everything that followed. Consider what this meant in practice. A Roman citizen, a man of wealth and status, could father a child with an enslaved woman in his household. That child would be born into slavery. That child would be his property. He could sell that child, give that child away, punish that child, use that child for labor or for other purposes, all without legal consequence. The child's mother had no rights. The child had no rights. The father's relationship to his own offspring was not that of parent to child, but of owner to property. This was not a loophole or an unintended consequence. This was the system working exactly as designed. Roman masters understood the implications perfectly. They recognized that enslaved women's reproductive capacity represented a source of value independent of their labor. A healthy female slave of childbearing age was worth more than a comparable male slave because she could produce new slaves, increasing the master's wealth without requiring additional purchase. This economic logic drove behavior throughout Roman society. Masters who had no personal interest in their female slaves nonetheless ensured those slaves became pregnant, either by providing access to male slaves or by using them personally. The children produced were assets on the household ledger, recorded alongside furniture and livestock and land. The term for homeborn slaves was vernae, and they commanded significant premiums in Roman slave markets. A verna had advantages over a slave captured in warfare or purchased from foreign traders. Vernae had been raised within Roman households, trained from infancy in Roman customs and expectations. They knew no other life. They had no memories of freedom to make them restless, no language or culture that might connect them to identities beyond their enslavement. Vernae were, in modern terms, institutionalized from birth. They were the most compliant, the most efficient, the most valuable form of human property that Roman markets offered. And so masters bred them deliberately. The household of Gaius Servilius Vadia was not unusual in this respect. What made Vadia unusual was the systematic attention he brought to the practice, the records he kept, the calculations he performed. Where other masters bred slaves casually, according to opportunity and impulse, Vadia approached reproduction with the same analytical rigor he applied to his other investments. He had inherited the Villa Serviliana from his father, along with approximately 80 slaves who worked the agricultural estate and maintained the household. Within 5 years, he had increased this number to 120, not primarily through purchase, but through what he called natural increase. He had identified the most fertile women among his slaves, ensured they became pregnant regularly, and managed the resulting children as a portfolio of assets maturing at different rates. His records, fragments of which survived in documents that later scholars found too distasteful to examine closely, reveal the mind behind the method. He tracked each pregnancy from conception to delivery. He noted the father, whether himself or a male slave he had selected for desirable characteristics. He recorded birth weights, early development, health indicators. He calculated the cost of maintaining each child through infancy and childhood against the projected value at different ages. A male child, his records showed, could be sold profitably at age 10, when he was old enough to perform useful labor, but young enough to be trained by his purchaser. A female child was more valuable retained, because at maturity she could produce additional slaves. The mathematics were simple. A female slave who survived to childbearing age and produced 5 children over her reproductive years generated more value than any sale price would provide. Vadia did not see this as cruelty. He saw it as rationality. He was optimizing a system that existed long before his birth and would continue long after his death. The system treated human beings as property. He simply managed his property effectively. This is what made him fascinating to his contemporaries and horrifying to us. Not exceptional evil, but exceptional competence in a system that was itself evil. The banality of his approach, the business-like language of his records, the complete absence of any recognition that his property might have feelings or preferences or rights, these reveal more about Roman slavery than any account of exceptional cruelty could. Vadia was not a monster by Roman standards. He was a successful businessman. The slaves he owned were well fed because malnourished slaves were less productive. They were housed adequately because sick slaves required expensive treatment or replacement. They were not beaten capriciously because injured slaves could not work. By every metric Romans used to evaluate slave management, Vadia was a model master. His slaves were healthy. His estate was profitable. His methods were studied by neighbors, seeking to improve their own operations. And those methods included the systematic impregnation of female slaves, the careful tracking of their reproductive output, and the calculated decisions about which children to keep, which to sell, and which to dispose of. This was the man who owned Petronia. This was the system into which her child would be born. Now, let us return to Petronia, still standing in the examination room, still processing what she has just heard. The physician's verdict, that she likely carries a female child, has produced a reaction in her master that she does not understand. Satisfaction, even something approaching pleasure. But why would Vatia specifically want a daughter from her? What value does a female child have that would produce that reaction? She learns the answer over the following weeks, in fragments and whispers, as other slaves share what they know about the master's methods. He has plans for the girls. An older woman named Horatia tells her one evening in the slave quarters. Horatia has been in this household for 30 years, has watched 3 owners come and go, has survived by making herself useful and keeping her observations to herself. She speaks to Petronia because Petronia asked, and because Horatia remembers what it was like to be young and pregnant and terrified. What kind of plans? Horatia looks around to ensure they are not overheard. The master keeps the female children born to certain mothers, the mothers with good features, good intelligence, good health. These children are raised carefully, trained in specific skills, prepared for specific purposes. What purposes? When they reach maturity, he sells them to wealthy households in Rome, not as common laborers, as something else. Horatia pauses, weighing how much to say. The buyers pay premium prices for young women who are beautiful, educated, trained in music and conversation, prepared to serve as companions. Do you understand what I am telling you? Petronia understands. She feels ice spreading through her chest, despite the warmth of the evening. He breeds them for that? He selects mothers who will produce daughters with particular qualities. You are beautiful, Petronia. You are intelligent. You learn to read, which few slaves bother with. You carry yourself well. Your child will inherit these things. Your daughter will be raised to become valuable in ways that common slaves are not. And then sold to be whatever her buyer wants. Yes. Petronia's hands move to her belly, cradling the life she carries. For months she has wondered about this child, imagined what her daughter might become, allowed herself moments of something almost like hope. Now she understands that her daughter's future has already been determined, that Vatia's satisfaction reflected not paternal pride, but commercial calculation, that the child she will bring into the world has been categorized as a particular type of investment before taking her first breath. What happened to your children? Petronia asks Horatia. She knows that the older woman has been pregnant multiple times over her 30 years in slavery. She does not know what became of those pregnancies. Horatia's face changes. The careful neutrality that slaves cultivate to survive is replaced, briefly, by something raw. Slaves cultivate to survive is replaced, briefly, by something raw. I had 6, she says. The first 2 were boys. They were sold when they turned 10. I do not know where. The third was a girl. She was not right. Something wrong with her mind. She was exposed on the 3rd day. Exposed. The Roman practice of abandoning unwanted infants outside the city walls, leaving them to die of exposure, or to be collected by those who made use of such children. Legal, common, unremarkable. The 4th was a boy, strong, healthy. The master kept him for labor here. He works in the fields now. I see him sometimes. He does not know I am his mother. He was taken from me at weaning and raised in the children's quarters. I was not permitted to tell him. And the others? 2 more girls. Both were selected for the special training. Both were sold to households in Rome when they reached 18. I do not know what happened to them after that. I am not supposed to ask. I am not supposed to remember that they exist. Horatia meets Petronia's eyes with an expression that contains decades of accumulated grief, compressed into something hard and cold and survivable. Your daughter will be trained and sold. This is certain. What is not certain is what you can do about it. Probably nothing. The master's plans are the master's plans. But you should know what is coming. You should have time to prepare yourself. Because the hardest part is not the pregnancy, or the birth, or even the separation. The hardest part is continuing to exist afterward, knowing what was done to someone who came from your body, and knowing that you could not prevent it. Petronia absorbs this information in silence. She does not cry. She has learned, as all slaves learn, that tears accomplish nothing and risk drawing unwanted attention. She simply files this knowledge alongside everything else she knows about her situation, adding it to the calculations she has been making since she first understood that the life growing inside her would complicate everything. That night, alone in the darkness of her sleeping cell, she allows herself to think about alternatives. She could attempt to end the pregnancy. There are herbs that some slave women know about, methods passed down through generations of women who found themselves carrying children they could not protect. But these methods are dangerous, often deadly, and if she survives and Vatia discovers what she has done, the punishment would be severe. Destroying a master's property carried consequences. She could attempt to escape, but escape to where? She knows no one outside this estate. She has no money, no resources, no documentation that would allow her to pass as free. Escaped slaves were hunted, captured, returned to their owners for punishment, or sold to new owners who would ensure they never attempted escape again. She could attempt to kill herself. Some pregnant slaves did, preferring death to bringing children into slavery. But Petronia finds that she wants to live. Despite everything, despite what she now knows about her daughter's future, she wants to see her child, to hold her, to have whatever time they will be allowed together before separation comes. She could accept the situation, cooperate, make herself useful, hope that her compliance earns her small privileges, perhaps the chance to see her daughter occasionally as she grows, perhaps even some influence over the child's training and preparation. This is what most slave women did. This is what the system was designed to produce: acceptance, cooperation, the channeling of maternal instinct into compliance rather than resistance. Petronia is not certain what she will do. She has 7 more weeks before the child arrives, 7 weeks to observe and think and plan. She will use that time. But she already knows one thing with absolute certainty. She will remember. Whatever happens to her daughter, whatever Vatia does, whatever the future holds, she will remember that a child was taken from her and used for someone else's profit. She will remember the name of the man who did it. She will remember every detail of this system that treats human beings as breeding stock. And if she ever has the opportunity to do something with that memory, she will take it. The Roman legal system that enabled masters like Vatia to treat enslaved women as reproductive resources was not created by accident. It was built deliberately over centuries, refined by some of the ancient world's most celebrated legal minds, codified in texts that Western civilization would later claim as foundations of justice and rights. The principle of partus sequitur ventrem appears in the earliest Roman legal sources, suggesting that it was already established by the time Romans began recording their laws. The principle solved what lawmakers saw as a practical problem: how to determine the status of children born to parents of different conditions. By tying a child's status to the mother rather than the father, the law created clarity where ambiguity might otherwise exist. But the principle also created something else, a system where the children of enslaved women were automatically enslaved, regardless of paternity, providing masters with both reproductive access to their property and ownership of any offspring that resulted. Roman jurists discuss this principle extensively, not to question its justice, but to clarify its applications. What if a free woman was enslaved during pregnancy? The child would be free because status was determined at conception when the mother was still free. What if an enslaved woman was freed during pregnancy? The child would be free, because status was determined at birth when the mother was free. What if an enslaved woman was briefly freed and then re-enslaved before giving birth? The child would be free, because any moment of maternal freedom during pregnancy was sufficient to transmit freedom to the child. These discussions reveal minds capable of extraordinary analytical precision, applied to questions that assume the fundamental legitimacy of owning human beings. The jurists were not troubled by the existence of slavery. They were troubled only by edge cases that might create uncertainty about property rights. The same analytical precision applied to the reproductive capacity of enslaved women. Roman law recognized that this capacity had economic value separate from labor value, and developed frameworks to protect owners' interests in that value. If a slave woman was sold while pregnant, the sale included the unborn child, unless specifically excluded. If a slave woman was given as security for a debt, her children born during the debt period belonged to the creditor, unless the debt was repaid. If a slave woman was jointly owned by multiple masters, her children were divided among them according to their ownership shares. The language of Roman legal texts discusses these matters with the same tone used for livestock breeding. The terms are agricultural, the framework is commercial. The humanity of the women and children involved is not legally relevant. This legal framework created the conditions for practices that modern observers would recognize as systematic reproductive exploitation. Masters could use enslaved women sexually without consequence because the women were property and property cannot be wronged. Masters could force enslaved women to become pregnant through selected partners because managing livestock reproduction was a normal aspect of property management. Masters could separate children from mothers because property can be divided and transferred according to owner preferences. The children born into this system, the vernae, occupied a legal category that was simultaneously clear and horrifying. They were property from the moment of birth. They had no parents in the legal sense, only owners. The women who bore them had no maternal rights, only duties to their masters. The men who fathered them had no paternal obligations, only property interests. A master who fathered a child with his own slave faced no legal consequences and owed no duties to either mother or child. He could acknowledge the relationship or deny it, support the child or sell it, keep the family together or separate them according to his preferences. The decision was entirely his, constrained only by economic calculations about which choice would be most profitable. Some masters did acknowledge their enslaved children, treating them with something approaching paternal affection, sometimes eventually freeing them and providing for their education and careers. Roman history records numerous instances of successful individuals who began life as vernae, freed by their master fathers and given opportunities that allowed them to rise in Roman society. But these instances were exceptions, notable precisely because they departed from the norm. The norm was what Gaius Servilius Vatia practiced: systematic management of reproduction as an economic activity, children as assets on a ledger, mothers as production units whose output was measured and optimized. And the norm included practices that went beyond simple exploitation into active cruelty, practices that the legal system not only permitted, but implicitly encouraged. What happened when a pregnancy was inconvenient? When a master wanted a female slave's labor without the interruption of childbearing? When a pregnancy resulted from an encounter the master had not authorized? The law was clear. A master could do whatever he wished with his own property. If he wished to terminate a pregnancy, that was his right. If he wished to punish a slave for becoming pregnant, that was his right. Roman medical texts include discussions of abortifacient substances, methods for ending pregnancies at various stages. Some of these texts specifically address the use of such methods on enslaved women, treating the decision as a routine matter of household management. If a pregnancy reduced a slave's value or interfered with her duties, termination was a practical solution. Other masters took the opposite approach, forbidding their female slaves from any behavior that might prevent or terminate pregnancy. These masters wanted maximum reproductive output and punished any interference with that goal. Some households imposed pregnancy quotas, requiring female slaves to produce a specified number of children over their reproductive years, with punishment for those who failed to meet targets. Both approaches, forced termination and forced continuation, treated women's bodies as resources to be managed according to owner preferences. Neither approach recognized any interest of the women themselves. The question was never what the enslaved woman wanted, only what would produce the best return on the master's investment. This was the system Petronia existed within. This was the legal framework that gave Vatia unlimited authority over her body, her child, and her future. This was Roman civilization at its most systematic, its most rational, its most horrifying. The child was born on a clear morning in early spring, when the almond trees along the Via Appia were beginning to bloom, and the air carried the first warmth of the coming season. The delivery was difficult, but not dangerous, lasting 18 hours before the infant finally emerged, squalling and red-faced, into the hands of the midwife, who had attended dozens of such births in this household. A girl, as the physician had predicted, healthy, perfect, beautiful, even in those first moments, with large, dark eyes and delicate features that already hinted at the woman she would become. Petronia held her daughter for the first time and felt something shift inside her, some fundamental reordering of priorities and possibilities. This small life, this person who had been part of her body and was now separate from it, this child who did not yet know what world she had been born into, suddenly mattered more than anything Petronia had ever experienced. She named her Lucia after the light that had filled the room as the child took her first breath. The name was not official. Slaves were named by their masters, and Vatia had not yet indicated what he wished the child to be called. But in Petronia's heart, in the private space where she preserved what remained of her own identity, the child was Lucia. The first weeks passed in a haze of nursing and exhaustion and the overwhelming intensity of new motherhood. Vatia permitted Petronia to remain with the infant during this period, recognizing that the child needed her mother's milk to survive. He did not visit the slave quarters to inspect his new property. He did not interfere with the bonding that was occurring between mother and child. He did not need to. The system would assert itself soon enough. When Lucia was 6 weeks old, the household steward came to the slave quarters with instructions. The child was to be examined by the physician, assessed for health and potential, registered in the household records. Petronia was to bring her to the main house. The examination was thorough. The physician checked the infant's limbs, her reflexes, her responses to stimuli. He measured her head, estimated her likely adult proportions, noted the features she had inherited from her mother. He made marks on a wax tablet, while Petronia stood watching, holding herself still through force of will. Vatia observed from the doorway, his expression revealing nothing. "Excellent specimen," the physician announced when the examination was complete. "Strong, healthy, well-proportioned. She has inherited her mother's features, which will serve her well. Assuming normal development, she should reach the highest quality category by maturity. The mother will continue nursing for 1 year," Vatia said. "After weaning, the child will be transferred to the special quarters for training. The mother will return to normal duties and will be made available for breeding again within 3 months." Petronia felt the words land like physical blows. 1 year. She had 1 year with her daughter before Lucia was taken to begin the process that would transform her into a product for sale. 1 year before the child she had created was absorbed into a system designed to extract maximum value from her beauty and her intelligence and her youth. "Do you understand?" Vatia asked, addressing Petronia directly for the first time since the examination began. "Yes, master." The words came automatically, the response trained into her through years of slavery. "Good. The child's name will be Prima. She is the first of what I hope will be a productive line. You have done well. Continue to nurse her adequately, and you will be permitted to see her occasionally after the transfer. Prima, first." A name that reduced her daughter to a position in a sequence, the first of however many children Petronia would be required to produce, the first entry in a breeding program designed to generate beautiful, intelligent, trained young women for sale to wealthy Romans. Petronia carried her daughter back to the slave quarters, holding Lucia, holding Prima, holding this small life that was already being shaped by forces neither of them could control. She had 1 year, 365 days, perhaps 3,000 waking hours with her child before separation. She would use every one of them. The year passed faster than Petronia could have imagined. The days blurred together, an endless cycle of nursing and tending and watching her daughter develop from a squalling infant into a curious, observant child who seemed to understand more than a child her age should understand. Lucia was not yet a year old when she first demonstrated the intelligence that had made her mother valuable and would make her even more so. She watched faces with uncanny attention, tracking expressions and responses as if cataloging them for future reference. She learned to recognize individual household members, lighting up when Petronia appeared and going still and watchful when strangers entered the slave quarters. She did not cry unnecessarily. She seemed to understand, even at that young age, that attention could be dangerous, that silence was often safer than noise. Petronia taught her what she could during their time together. She whispered stories at night, tales from the Greek traditions that educated slaves sometimes preserved, myths of gods and heroes and women who found ways to survive impossible situations. She sang songs that her own mother had sung to her, melodies passed down through generations of enslaved women who had nothing to give their children except memories and music. She taught her the word for love in 3 languages. She taught her the word for mother. She taught her that she was wanted, that she was precious, that someone in the world valued her as more than property. She knew these lessons would be systematically erased in the training that followed. She knew that Lucia would be taught to forget her mother, to suppress any attachment that might complicate her function as a product for sale. She knew that all her efforts might accomplish nothing. She taught her anyway, because doing something was better than doing nothing, because the teaching was as much for herself as for her daughter, because she needed to believe that some trace of their connection might survive what was coming. The day of separation arrived with brutal clarity. No warning, no preparation, no opportunity for farewell. Guards appeared at the slave quarters at dawn, collected the child from Petronia's arms while she was still groggy with sleep, and carried Lucia away before the screaming could begin. Petronia screamed anyway. She screamed until her voice gave out, until the other slaves restrained her to prevent self-injury, until the household steward arrived with a whip and applied it until she stopped. The physical pain was nothing. She had experienced worse during the delivery. The real pain was in her chest, a tearing sensation that had nothing to do with her body, as if something essential had been ripped out of her and carried away. She did not see her daughter again for 3 years. The training facility was a separate building on the far side of the estate, invisible from the main house and the slave quarters, a world unto itself where children were transformed into valuable products. Petronia learned about it in fragments over the years, from slaves who had worked there, from whispered conversations with women whose children had passed through the same process. The children were raised communally, their individual mothers erased from their consciousness as completely as possible. They were taught that they had always been there, that the training facility was their home, that the instructors who shaped their development were the only adults who mattered. They were educated to a degree unusual for slaves, learning to read and write and calculate, studying music and dance and the arts of conversation. They were taught to be entertaining, to please, to anticipate the desires of those they would eventually serve. They were trained in the specific skills that wealthy Romans valued in their household companions: literacy, cultural knowledge, social graces, physical appeal. They were also taught submission, not merely obedience, which any slave could be beaten into, but genuine acceptance of their status, internalized belief in their own inferiority, psychological conditioning that would make them compliant partners rather than resentful prisoners. The methods used to achieve this conditioning were sophisticated, developed over generations of practice: rewards for appropriate behavior, isolation for inappropriate attachment, careful manipulation of the children's emotional development to channel their capacity for love toward their future owners rather than toward each other or toward biological family they were taught to forget. By the time a child from the training facility reached maturity, she was a different person than the infant who had entered. She knew nothing of her origins, felt no connection to the mother who had borne her, understood herself only as a product designed to serve. This was what happened to Lucia, or Prima, as she was called, in the training facility. This was the transformation that Petronia could do nothing to prevent. But Petronia was not entirely powerless. Over the 3 years following separation, she found ways to learn about her daughter's progress. She cultivated relationships with slaves who worked in the training facility, trading favors and information, building a network of contacts who would tell her how Lucia was developing. The reports were mixed. Lucia was intelligent, exceeding the educational targets for her age group. She was beautiful, her features maturing in ways that promised exceptional value at sale. She was skilled at music, showing particular talent for the lyre, which would make her more attractive to cultured buyers. But she was also difficult. She asked questions that the instructors found troubling, questions about her origins, about the world beyond the facility, about why things were the way they were. She formed attachments to other children that had to be broken through isolation. She showed signs of independent thought that the training was designed to eliminate. The instructors called these qualities defects. They applied additional conditioning to suppress them. They reported to Vatia that the child might require extended training to reach appropriate compliance levels. Petronia heard these reports and felt something complicated: grief that her daughter was suffering, pride that Lucia was resisting, fear that continued resistance would bring worse consequences. She began planning again, thinking about possibilities that had seemed impossible 3 years earlier. She was older now, more experienced, better connected within the household's slave community. She understood the system more completely, had identified its weaknesses, had found others who shared her quiet hatred of what their lives had become. She could not rescue her daughter directly. She was still a slave, still property, still subject to a master's unlimited authority. But she could perhaps influence events. She could perhaps find opportunities that others would miss. She could perhaps do something that would matter, even if she could not do everything. The plan that eventually formed was not dramatic. It did not involve escape or violence or any of the actions that slaves sometimes attempted in desperation. It involved something more subtle: the manipulation of economic interests, the exploitation of Vatia's own methods against him. Petronia had learned, over years of observation, how her master made decisions. He was not motivated by cruelty for its own sake. He was motivated by profit. Every choice he made reflected calculations about value, return, optimization of resources. If she could change those calculations, she might be able to change his decisions. The opportunity came when Lucia was 7 years old enough to be evaluated for potential sale value, young enough that the sale itself was still years away. A buyer had expressed interest in the training facility's products. Not an ordinary buyer, but a representative of one of Rome's wealthiest households, seeking a specific type of acquisition for a specific type of purpose. The representative had heard of Vatia's operation, the quality of his products, the premium prices his trained slaves commanded. He wanted to inspect the current inventory and potentially place an advance order. Petronia learned of this visit through her network 3 days before it occurred. She learned that Lucia, now called Prima, was among the children who would be presented for evaluation. She learned that the buyer was particularly interested in intelligent children who showed musical talent, that Lucia's profile matched exactly what he was seeking. She learned, in other words, that her daughter might be sold within the year to a household in Rome, disappearing forever into a life that Petronia could not follow or observe or influence in any way. She had 3 days. The plan she developed was simple in concept, complex in execution. It required her to reach Lucia before the inspection, to communicate something that would affect how her daughter presented herself, to trust that a 7-year-old child she had not seen in years would understand and act on information delivered by a stranger. It required her to risk everything on a possibility that might accomplish nothing. She took the risk. The night before the inspection, Petronia bribed a slave who worked in the training facility to deliver a message. The message was brief, carefully worded to avoid revealing its source or purpose to anyone who might intercept it. It said, "Your mother remembers your true name. Be difficult. Be troublesome. Make them think you are defective. This is how you survive." She did not know if Lucia would receive the message. She did not know if Lucia would understand it. She did not know if understanding would lead to action, or if action would produce the result she intended. She only knew that she had done something, that she had tried, that she had refused to accept her helplessness completely. The inspection occurred the following day. Petronia was not present, could not be present, could only wait in the slave quarters for news that filtered back through her network of informants. The news, when it came, was remarkable. Prima, the 7-year-old product of Vatia's breeding program, had performed perfectly during the educational assessments. She had demonstrated exactly the intelligence and cultural knowledge that the buyer sought. She had displayed musical talent that exceeded expectations. And then, during the personal interview that concluded the inspection, she had done something unprecedented. She had looked the buyer's representative directly in the eyes, which trained slaves were never supposed to do. She had asked him a question. "What will happen to me if you buy me?" The question itself was not problematic. Children asked questions. But the way she asked it, with clear awareness of her situation and its implications, with a directness that suggested thought rather than training, disturbed the representative. He noted in his report that the child showed signs of independent cognition that might prove difficult to manage, that she might not adapt well to household service, that her intelligence could become a liability rather than an asset if not properly controlled. He recommended against purchase. He suggested that Vatia invest additional resources in conditioning to eliminate the problematic traits before attempting to sell. When Vatia received this report, he was furious. A sale that should have been straightforward had been disrupted by defects in the product. His breeding program had produced a specimen that was simultaneously too intelligent and too aware, valuable in some dimensions and unmarketable in others. He ordered intensified conditioning. He demanded that the training facility break whatever capacity for independent thought still remained in the child. But he did not sell her. Not immediately. Not to this buyer, or the next one, or the one after that. Each time Lucia was presented for sale, something went wrong. A question at the wrong moment. A glance that suggested thoughts a slave should not have. A hint of personality beneath the trained compliance. The buyers passed. The sales failed. Lucia remained in the training facility, subjected to increasingly harsh conditioning, but remaining, surviving, not disappearing into Roman households where Petronia could never find her. Years passed. Petronia continued sending messages when she could, brief encouragements, reminders that someone remembered her true name, instructions to continue resisting in ways subtle enough to avoid severe punishment but obvious enough to discourage purchase. And Lucia, somehow, understood. She walked a line between compliance and resistance, appearing obedient enough to avoid the worst consequences, while maintaining just enough difficulty to make buyers hesitate. She survived childhood in the training facility. She reached adolescence, then young adulthood, still unpurchased, still present, still somewhere Petronia could receive occasional word about her welfare. By the time Lucia turned 18, Vadia faced a problem his system was not designed to handle. He had invested years of resources in a product that refused to become fully marketable. He had applied every conditioning technique available, and still she retained some core of self that potential buyers sensed and avoided. His records showed a loss on the investment. His calculations indicated that continued retention was economically irrational. His methods suggested disposal. But disposal of an 18-year-old woman who was healthy, beautiful, and capable was not simple. Exposure was for infants. Execution required justification he could not provide. Sale at reduced prices would damage his reputation as a producer of premium products. He was trapped by his own system, holding property he could neither use nor discard without cost. And Petronia, now 40 years old, still enslaved, still observant, still planning, saw an opportunity that 17 years of patient resistance had finally created. The opportunity came through an unexpected source: Vatia's legitimate daughter, a woman named Servilia, who had married into a prominent at her father's estate with her husband and children. Servilia was not cruel by the standards of her class. She treated the household slaves with the casual indifference that Roman aristocrats considered appropriate, not harsh, not kind, simply unaware of them as persons with inner lives. But she had one characteristic that Petronia had identified and cultivated over years of careful observation. Servilia was competitive. She competed with other aristocratic women for social status, for the quality of her household, for the elegance of her entertainments. She competed with her husband's sisters, with her own relatives, with women she had known since childhood. Every aspect of her public presentation was a battlefield where victory meant recognition and defeat meant invisible diminishment. And Servilia had noticed, during her visits to her father's estate, that he possessed something her competitors did not: access to exceptionally trained household slaves that commanded premium prices and carried prestige for their owners. Petronia had positioned herself, over years of careful maneuvering, to become one of Servilia's attendants during these visits. She had made herself useful, anticipated needs, demonstrated the intelligence and cultural knowledge that Vatia's breeding program was designed to produce. She had become, without ever stating it directly, an example of what her master's methods could create. And she had planted seeds. The young women from the training facility, she mentioned once, casually, while arranging Servilia's hair. I have heard they are remarkable, educated, musical, graceful. A household that possessed such a woman would be distinguished among all others. Servilia's interest was piqued, but not activated. The seed was planted, left to germinate. Months later, during another visit, the master has one in particular, I hear, who is exceptional. Too exceptional, some say. She has been offered to buyers, but none have proven worthy of her quality. The implication was clear. Owning this slave would demonstrate superior status, would prove that Servilia was worthy of what others had been denied. The seed began to grow. By the time Petronia was ready to make her move, Servilia had convinced herself that acquiring her father's most exceptional slave was something she wanted, something she deserved, something that would demonstrate her position among Roman aristocracy. She approached Vatia with a request. She wanted prima, the unmarketable product, the investment that had never returned its value. She wanted to demonstrate that what common buyers could not handle, she could manage successfully. Vatia's calculations shifted. Selling to his daughter would not damage his reputation, as it would sell to ordinary buyers at reduced prices. He would receive something rather than nothing for his failed investment. He would please his daughter, which had political value within his family network. He agreed. Prima was sold to Servilia, transferred from the training facility to Servilia's household in Rome, removed from Vatia's estate entirely. But Petronia had not finished. In the negotiations that accompanied the sale, she found a way to insert herself into the arrangement. She suggested to Servilia, subtly, that a slave from the same source might help manage the transition, might help the new acquisition adapt to household service, might serve as an example of successful integration. Servilia, who had found Petronia useful, agreed to purchase her as well. For the first time in 17 years, Petronia and her daughter would live in the same household. The reunion was not what Petronia had imagined during the years of separation. Lucia did not recognize her. The conditioning, though incomplete, had been effective enough to erase memories of infancy, to sever the conscious connection between the young woman she had become and the mother who had carried her. They met as strangers, two slaves in a new household, assigned to duties that occasionally overlapped but did not require close interaction. Petronia could see her daughter daily, could watch her from across rooms, could hear her voice and observe her movements, but could not simply reveal the truth and expect it to be understood. The truth required preparation. It required trust. It required time that they might or might not have. Petronia was patient. She had been patient for 17 years. She could be patient longer. She began with small kindnesses, favors that slaves in a household sometimes exchange, gestures that created obligation and connection without revealing their source. She helped Lucia navigate the complexities of the new household, offered advice that proved useful, demonstrated reliability that earned gradual trust. Months passed. The relationship developed from strangers to acquaintances to something approaching friendship, the kind of bond that sometimes formed between slaves who recognized something in each other that transcended their condition. Only then did Petronia begin to tell the truth. Not all at once, not directly, but in fragments, in stories that might have been about someone else, in questions that prompted Lucia to remember things she thought she had forgotten. "Do you know the Greek myths?" Petronia asked one evening, when they were alone and unobserved. The story of Demeter and Persephone, the mother who searched the world for her stolen daughter. "I learned it in training," Lucia said. "It was part of the cultural curriculum. What did you think of it?" Lucia was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was sad. The separation, the searching, the impossibility of truly recovering what was lost. But Persephone was recovered in the end. Not completely, not as she had been. But mother and daughter found each other again. In the myth. But myths are just stories we tell about what we wish were possible." Petronia paused, weighing her next words. "What if I told you a story about a different mother and daughter? A story that is not a myth?" Lucia looked at her with the sharp attention that years of training had honed into a survival skill. "What story?" And Petronia told her. Everything. The pregnancy, the examination, the year they had together, the separation, the messages, the years of waiting, the plan that had brought them both to this household. She told her daughter who she was. The silence that followed was long and complex. Lucia's face moved through expressions that Petronia could not fully read, emotions processed. "You have been planning this for 17 years. Longer, since before you were born, since the moment I understood what would happen to you. Why did you not rescue me sooner? Why did you not escape? Take me with you. Find some way." There was no way. I am a slave. You are a slave. We are property. The only power I had was patience and the ability to understand the system well enough to manipulate it. And now? Petronia reached out and touched her daughter's face, the first intentional contact since the separation, the first time she had touched Lucia as her mother rather than as a stranger. Now we are together. Now we can face what comes as family rather than alone. Now you know that someone has always loved you, has always remembered you, has always been working to find you. That is not freedom, Lucia said. We are still slaves. We are still property. We are still subject to whatever our owner decides. I know, but it is something. It is more than we had before, and perhaps together we can find ways to make it more still. Lucia did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice carried something new, something that had not been present in the trained compliance she had worn like armor. Tell me about your plan, she said. Tell me what comes next. What came next was not escape or freedom or any dramatic transformation of their circumstances. What came next was something smaller and larger simultaneously, the construction of a life within the constraints that still bound them. Petronia and Lucia became known in Servilia's household as exceptionally valuable slaves, their intelligence and capability making them indispensable to daily operations. They rose in the household hierarchy, acquiring responsibilities and privileges that common slaves did not enjoy. They earned positions of trust that gave them access to information and influence beyond what their status should have allowed. They also earned something else: the opportunity to help others. The household included other slaves, including other women who had been bred and sold, other mothers separated from children, other victims of the system that had shaped Petronia's life. Together, mother and daughter began building networks, sharing information, creating connections that transcended individual households. They could not end slavery. They could not transform Roman society. They could not save everyone who suffered under the system that owned them. But they could save some. They could manipulate circumstances to keep families together when possible, to soften the harshest aspects of their condition, to preserve memories and connections that the system was designed to destroy. They could remember. They could bear witness. They could refuse to accept that their humanity had been erased simply because the law declared them property. Petronia lived another 22 years, dying at 62, an old woman by ancient standards. She never gained freedom. She remained a slave until her death, property of a household that valued her service but never acknowledged her personhood. But she died with her daughter beside her. She died knowing that the connection she had fought to preserve had survived everything the system had done to destroy it. She died having made a difference, however small, in the lives of others who suffered as she had suffered. Lucia lived another 30 years after her mother's death, eventually earning manumission from Servilia's grandson, who freed her in his will as a reward for decades of loyal service. She was 70 years old when she finally became legally free, her life mostly behind her, her body worn by years of labor. But she used her freedom to do something that slaves could not do, she wrote. She wrote about her mother. She wrote about the training facility, the breeding program, the system that had shaped her childhood. She wrote about what Roman masters did to female slaves who became pregnant, the calculations and cruelties, the children bred and sold, the mothers whose grief was not legally recognized because property cannot grieve. Her account did not survive in its original form. No document written by a freed slave woman in the late Roman period was considered important enough to copy and preserve. But fragments of her story were incorporated into later texts, references, and quotations that scholars have traced back to an original source they call the Testimony of Prima. These fragments are part of how we know what we know about Roman slavery's reproductive dimensions. These fragments, written by a woman who experienced the system directly, who understood it from inside, who refused to let it be forgotten, contribute to a historical record that might otherwise have sanitized what Rome actually did. The testimony is not complete. Much was lost. But what survives bears witness to realities that Roman civilization preferred to ignore, truths that marble monuments did not commemorate, suffering that heroic histories chose not to record. Petronia's name does not appear in any surviving text. We know her only through her daughter's references, through the story that Lucia preserved because her mother had preserved her. But she existed. She suffered. She resisted. She found ways to matter within a system designed to render her meaningless. And her story, incomplete as it is, reminds us that the foundations of civilizations we celebrate were built on the bodies of people who were never given the opportunity to celebrate anything. The Roman system that Petronia and Lucia experienced was not an aberration or a failure of Roman values. It was Roman values, applied consistently to their logical conclusions. The same legal minds that developed frameworks for contracts and property rights developed frameworks for owning and breeding human beings. The same rationality that built aqueducts and roads-built systems for extracting maximum value from enslaved women's reproductive capacity. This is what makes the history so difficult to confront. We want to separate Rome's achievements from Rome's crimes, to preserve the marble and the laws and the literature, while forgetting the human beings whose suffering made it possible. We want to believe that slavery was an unfortunate element of an otherwise admirable civilization, a failing that does not define what Rome truly was. But you cannot separate these things. The wealth that built the monuments came from slave labor. The leisure that enabled philosophy came from slave labor. The stability that allowed cultural achievement came from systems of control that treated millions of human beings as property. And within those systems, specific horrors occurred that the general term slavery does not capture. Women were bred like livestock. Children were raised as products for sale. Mothers were separated from infants and forbidden to remember them. Fathers owned their own children and disposed of them according to economic calculation. These were not exceptions. These were not aberrations. These were standard practices, documented in legal texts and agricultural manuals and household records, discussed by jurists and philosophers and ordinary Romans with the same casual acceptance they brought to any other aspect of daily life. Petronia's story is one among millions. She survived, found her daughter, built something meaningful within impossible constraints. Most did not. Most lived and died in conditions that we can only partially reconstruct, their individual experiences lost to a historical record that did not consider them worth preserving. But the system they experienced is documented. The laws exist. The records exist. The evidence exists for anyone willing to look at it without the filters that centuries of admiration for Rome have created. What Roman masters did to female slaves who became pregnant was not hidden. It was public, legal, accepted, celebrated as good management and rational business practice. It was wrong by any moral standard we would now apply, and it was also normal, ordinary, unremarkable in its time. This is perhaps the hardest thing to understand about historical evil. It was not always committed by monsters who knew they were monstrous. It was often committed by ordinary people who believed they were behaving reasonably, managing their property appropriately, following the laws and customs of their civilization. Gaius Servilius Vatia was not unusual. He was typical. He represented what Roman slave-owning society produced when it applied its values consistently, without the moderating influence of any recognition that enslaved people were people. And the women and children he bred and sold and disposed of paid the price for his society's moral failure. Remember Petronia. Remember Lucia. Remember the millions of women whose names we do not know, whose stories were never written, whose children were taken from them, and whose grief was not acknowledged. Remember that Civilization is not only what survives in museums and textbooks, it is also what was done to human beings whose suffering made those achievements possible. Remember that legal systems can enshrine profound injustice, that rationality can serve evil ends, that intelligence applied without empathy produces horrors more systematic than any cruelty born of passion. Remember that resistance is possible, even within systems designed to make resistance impossible. That connection can survive efforts to destroy it, that humanity persists in conditions designed to eliminate it. Remember that the women who bore children into slavery loved those children, wanted to protect them, grieved when they were taken, never stopped hoping for reunion, even when hope was irrational. Remember that they were people. Subscribe if you want more histories that look at the past without the filters of celebration and admiration. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand Rome from the heroic stories they learned in school.